Greetings, ladies and gentlemen of the internet. Jan Michael here.
And I'm Tati.
Well, you knew this was going to happen. We talked about movies, we talked about video games. What else do we talk about on this channel? Anime. So of course we're going to talk and list our 10 favorite anime of the 90s. Somewhat.
With film distribution the way it was in the 90s, VHS, and especially anime, imported anime, was really hard to get a hold of. When an anime fan got something from Japan, they copied it and distributed it everywhere. I myself, as a fan, have a few anime VHSs that I still watch to this day, and it was the only way you got new episodes.
Because of the way that we were limited in the 90s, there's a couple of ground rules that we do want to set with our lists. First and foremost, these are true 90s anime, but maybe they didn't necessarily come out in the 90s here in America, but they were distributed in the 90s. The second thing is that the show didn't primarily have to all take place in the 90s. They could have continued into the 2000s, or heck, they could still be airing to this day. And lastly, we may include movies or OVAs just to kind of round off our list, so yeah, just cut us a break here, alright? Well, with all that said, shall we get started?
I think we should.
Let's do it with our number 10. Now, I always personally liked shows that revolved around collecting some sort of MacGuffin or what have you. It gave something that you could show off to show the progression that you were on and seeing how close you were to the finale, and bonus points if that MacGuffin gave you special powers. Which it certainly did in my number 10, Cardcaptor Sakura. Revolving around the titular Sakura, she is tasked with tracking down and capturing the cards of Clow after accidentally setting them all free. These cards have magic imbued in them, and if left alone can create chaos, hence the need to capture them as fast as possible. As Sakura collects them, she is able to tap into their individual power to give herself an edge against the other cards, essentially meaning she gets more powerful with each new card she collects. And that was pretty goddamn cool. As a kid, I loved seeing which cards she would go after next, what powers they had. I also loved how the danger level that they posed was different from one another. One of the cards could just be mischievous, while another could pose a genuine threat. And I loved as the plot kept thickening, the story grew bigger and bigger to the point that it felt like the main character was just part of this larger narrative at hand that she just happened to accidentally stumble upon. Now, while I do have fond memories of the show, I'll admit, coming back, I'm just not as invested as I once was. I thought that maybe the continuation that aired a few years ago may have been able to bring me back, but I just found it to be boring. As it stands, it's a nice series that I remember fondly, but not one that I really like to revisit. Maybe that makes it unworthy of a spot on this list, but I can't deny the appeal it had on a younger me.
I myself was always a fan of the Adventure Kid anime. You know, the one where the kid gets a little magical creature that's his best friend, and they go on these wonderful little magical adventures with each other. That's why my number 10 is Digimon. I watched this show every morning with my cereal before I went to school. It was something I never missed. I watched it alongside with music videos as I got older. Recently though, I watched it in its original Japanese and found that the American dub is really cleaned up. The Japanese version has a lot of dirty jokes, made by little children of course, which if you all have small children you know they're kind of gross. The dialogue also is a lot more campy, a lot more fun, and as I said, has a lot more dirty jokes in it. I never really got far in this anime, which is why it's in my 10, but it was something that's always going to be nostalgic to me.
I don't believe it.
Now, I want your balls, please.
What? No way. They're mine and I'm going to hang on to them.
Oh, you numbskull. I mean the 3 jewels on your sword.
Now, a lot of my early days of watching anime, I didn't even know I was watching anime. As a kid, I thought they were cartoons, and that's all they were to me. The only difference between anime and cartoons to me was that these cartoons, if you will, had a plot that continued onwards, which I found far more fascinating than the cartoons that just had a singular story that ended at the episode and then the next episode was something completely brand new. What does this have to do with my number 9? Well, the reason for it is because this was actually the first time that I realized, oh wait, cartoons can have a continuing storyline, which is what blew my mind when I saw my number 9, Tenchi Muyo. That being said, this show is a mess, and it all starts with its format. When I first came across it, I remember it being labeled as a show. It had episodes. It continued a story. That story being that a young boy awakens a demon that ends up falling in love with him, and as more and more women surround him with the same feelings, he needs to find ways to keep his sanity so they don't drive him insane. At least, that's how I remember it going. But Jan, you're probably saying, that isn't the anime at all, that's just the OVA. Yeah, well, I didn't know that, and I sure as hell don't remember it being marketed towards us like that either. So, fuck it, Tenchi Muyo makes it to my number 9 spot. Even though the show technically started with Tenchi Universe, but as you can see, it's a fucking mess. Apart from that, it just isn't that fun of a show to watch anymore. The harem genre has definitely come a long way, and a majority of these characters now are just plain annoying. I see a world where Tenchi could come back if done correctly, and I would most definitely welcome a chance to grab hold of those early days of anime that I remember so fondly.
Apparently while making my list, I learned that on top of little kids going on adventures, I also enjoyed watching little kid prodigies, which brings me to my number 9, Case Closed. Case Closed was an anime about a young high school boy named Shinichi Kuro, who is a detective. He has a friend, she's a girl, she pretends not to be his girlfriend, but we all know about the end of the series that's where it's gonna go. Shinichi puts his nose somewhere it shouldn't belong and gets turned into a young boy. The whole point of this series is him trying to figure out who turned him into a little boy so he can turn back into a high school student. This show is long-winded, a lot of episodes, and not a lot happens from episode to episode. It is episodic as each episode is a case that he solves, but for a really, really long time we're taken nowhere in his case. We don't find out who's turned him into a little kid till hundreds of episodes in. That was a lot of my problems with 90s anime. They're really long, and you only catch them once a week, so every time you catch them, you're kind of lost and forget where it is, which is why this show ended up on my number 9.
Yeah, who hasn't watched Sailor Moon at one point or another? I remember that a big part of why I watched the show is because I was still young enough to not be embarrassed by watching an all-female-led superhero-style show, which most definitely would have kept me from watching it as I got older. As for the show, it follows Serena, who along with the other Sailor Scouts must stop the domination of evil Queen Beryl, as well as other villains, from taking over. It's pretty basic when you take a step back, but again, I loved how the show had a goal that it was constantly aiming for. And this wasn't a case of, oh, you can't beat the evil queen because then the show ends type of deal, because they do beat her, and the show does not end, and I loved that. It gave a feeling of accomplishment since it showed the characters were getting stronger and they were achieving what they needed to do. As different enemies came into focus during different seasons, you saw new wrinkles introduced and new challenges that the Sailor Scouts had to overcome. And it kept things very, very exciting because you didn't know what powers the new enemies were going to have or how they were going to try to take over. And yes, it sounds very exciting when I'm talking about it, which, as a kid, you do find it exciting. Now, I hate to be a broken record here, but once again, this is not a show I find very enjoyable going back to. And like Cardcaptor Sakura, I was hoping the reboot a few years ago would be enough to get me back into it, but that just wasn't the case. As much as I hate to be one of those people, I think I may just have outgrown the show. But I still look back fondly on my time with it, and I'm glad it was a part of my childhood.
Reiterating my love for magical kids going on magical adventures anime, this is my number 7. It's Yu-Gi-Oh! Who knew, right? This was my Saturday morning staple. I woke up every Saturday morning at 6 a.m. to watch this show. I loved the cards, I collected them myself, maybe not as much as my number one spot, but this was still a show that held a special place in my heart. I would buy the Shonen Jump manga every time I visited my dad, so that I would be able to stay caught up on the storyline. However, because it was a show that was imported here from Japan, Fox Kids only played it up until Yu-Gi-Oh! GTX came out. I think it was Yu-Gi-Oh! GT, Yu-Gi-Oh! GTX, one of those two. That came out, it replaced it, and I never saw the ending to the original Yu-Gi-Oh!, which is why this anime kind of stays up high on my number 8 spot.
My number 7 is One Piece, and yes, I know, there really wasn't a lot of episodes that were around in the 90s. I think by the turn of the century we had only about 7 or 8, which really led up to the fight between Luffy and Buggy, so it's really not a lot to go on. But, unlike my previous entries, this is a show I can easily go back to and see these early episodes. And have. I freaking love the setup of this world. The legendary pirate Gold Roger announces before his death that he left all of his treasure in one place, appropriately named One Piece, and challenges the world to find it. Luffy sets out to find a ship and crew to claim One Piece and become king of the pirates. If that wasn't cool enough, there are fruits out in the world that give their eaters power in exchange for not being able to swim. Luffy happened to eat the Gum Gum fruit, which gives him rubber powers and an edge against most other pirates. One of my favorite things about the show was just seeing all the different powers that were going to be coming into play. At this point in the show, we really only had seen one other with Buggy, but it gave a really unique sense of what was coming in the future. These weren't just like, oh, fire, or water, the typical anime powers. They were unique. Rubber powers, powers where somebody could like chop themselves up. That was cool and unique. And really looking back, I like how simplistic and unique it all was, especially when you know where the show goes into the future. But what can I say? I have a soft spot for these early entry episodes. Also, on the note of the devil fruits, as they are called, I like how few people ever witnessed or saw them in the early entries of the show. I mean, fast forward to today's episodes where they've run out of ideas to the point that they have a fruit that gave the eater the power to become a jacket. Yeah. Some things were definitely better back then.
I'm gonna go ahead and break my streak of magical kid animes with my number 7, Rurouni Kenshin. This one being a more magical samurai anime. It takes place a little bit after the events of Samurai X, where Kenshin leaves his now dead wife and starts a new life. He meets a young woman who's the owner of a kendo training facility and ends up becoming friends with her, a little boy, and another sword fighter, and they have adventures together. This is another Toonami favorite, but sadly, something that, again, because of the time, it was only on once a week, so it was hard to keep caught up with. Recently, I got really sick and was able to watch a lot of the episodes, and got really far into the series. But sadly, like anything you binge watch, eventually it went to the wayside, and I got bored. I ended halfway through season 2. I wish I wouldn't have gotten bored. Maybe with the reboot of the new Rurouni Kenshin coming out, it'll catch my attention a little bit more. I think anime was still learning how to tell stories in the 90s, so it wasn't able to catch my attention at least. Like I said, to reiterate, I'm hoping with the reboot I'll get my attention caught a little bit more, but that's why this one is still a little high up at number 7.
Now, Digimon was another show that continued well into the 2000s, but unlike One Piece, there had been quite a bit of episodes that had come out by the turn of the century. By this point in time, the Digidestined had already returned home, beat a bunch of bad guys, saw how badass their Digimon could be, introduced the Dark Masters, and almost saw the end of the frickin' world. Yeah, it deserves a spot on this list. Now, the first question you may have is, isn't this some sort of cheap knockoff of Pokemon? To which I reply, kind of, if you're just looking at it from the outside. But as you get into the show, you see how different it actually is. The story here follows a bunch of kids who get sucked into the digital world where creatures called Digimon live. Each child partners with one of these Digimon and is able to help them grow into ferocious monsters capable of putting up a fight. As they travel the world looking for a way home, they discover why they were brought to this world to begin with, and their connection with the Digimon and each other. For a while, I was actually more excited to see Digimon than Pokemon, because while Pokemon tended to meander from time to time, I mean, you could easily miss an episode, come back to it, and really very easily just stay caught up with that show. Digimon actually had a story that you needed to follow each episode. You missed one episode, you come back, you felt like you missed a bunch of stuff. And so to me, it was more important to watch that over Pokemon at points. I also really liked these characters. They were constantly growing and bettering themselves. I liked the relationships they had with one another. As a side note, Tai and Sora definitely should have ended up together, but you know. I also won't comment on the future of the series, as it doesn't pertain to this list. But let's just say that they won't be making an appearance on any future installments that we may have.
Bringing in my number 6 with another magical teenage anime, Yu Yu Hakusho. The 90s really had a knack for long animes, and Yu Yu Hakusho was no exception. Although it's almost to my halfway mark, it's still a show I can never finish. I have tried and tried again, even as an adult, with some time on my hands, and can never pass the Dark Tournament. I get to the end, I take a mental break, and I never make it through. Like I've said before, the 90s, I think, was the heyday of anime writing. They were still learning how to write plot, storyline, and how to keep a story compelling. Anime now, it's much better, much more well-written, and although Yu Yu Hakusho is closer to my top 5 and my favorites, it still holds a higher number at number 6.
My number 5 goes to Cowboy Bebop. And I know what you're thinking. What? At number 5? How dare I? Easily. Cowboy Bebop was never a show that I was super excited to see every single time. And that's not to say I didn't like it. It's my number 5. But there were definitely other shows that I was more interested to watch. But still, this is a very damn good show. Now sure, in time as I got older, I have come around to this show about a bounty hunting crew and their wacky adventures in space, which is what a majority of the show is. We don't really get to the good stuff until later, and because of that, this is one of those shows that could bore kids, but it does fascinate adults, and is a perfect example of how not all anime is made for kids, a stigma that was definitely prevalent back then. Now really, there's not much more I can say that hasn't already been dissected and studied by a bunch of other YouTubers by now. So let me just state the obvious. Is the show cool? Yes it is. Does the story pick up? Hell yeah it does. Are the characters awesome? Of course they are. I'm just not as big a fan as it as a lot of other people are. But I will say if you have not watched the show, I highly recommend doing so. I mean, it is often regarded as the best anime of all time for a reason. And if that isn't enough to satiate your anger, I think we can all revel in our agreement that the Netflix live-action version sucked ass. Surely, we can all agree on that.
As my friend Jan said earlier in this segment, not all the anime on this list was a show. For example, my number 5 is a movie, Princess Mononoke. This movie follows the life of the protagonist, Ashitaka. He comes from a small village that suddenly is ravaged by an evil boar that is taken over by a demon. The boar dies in front of their village, but sadly Ashitaka is infected with its evil. He goes on a journey, leaves his village to find a cure. On his way, he finds a town that is led by a woman. She's kind, seemingly. She takes care of the women in her village and the men. But sadly, she's ravaging the forest around her, which that brings in our other protagonist, who we call Princess Mononoke. Her name is San. She's called the Wolf Girl. She lives with her mother and 2 brothers who are wolves. She's human. This anime holds a real special place in my heart because my dad accidentally brought it home for myself and my small cousins to watch, we being 10 at the time. So it was a very inappropriate movie to watch, however, it struck me. The animation, the storytelling, the music, everything about this film is amazing, which I wish I would have given it a higher spot, but because there's so many other 90s anime that held a much more special place in my heart, this one did have to sit at number 5.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was.
Getting into my top 4, I have Pokemon. And I know, didn't I just spend some time berating the show for meandering at points? And wait a minute, this gets higher than Cowboy Bebop? What, am I fucking stupid? Well, let me just remind you folks that for me, I love shows that you can easily go back to, especially when you can share them with family. This is a show that I actually can sit down with my daughter right now and she'll pay attention to. Can't really do that with Cowboy Bebop just yet, so yeah, for me, this does hold a more special place in my heart than something like Cowboy Bebop does. And as for the meandering thing, well, let's talk about the show first. The adventure here follows young Ash Ketchum on a quest to be a Pokemon master. It's the stuff of legends. It's that quest that we all envision and wish we could go on, despite it being an absolutely terrible practice if it happened in real life. Along the way, you have these monsters that are all different from one another that you can catch, train, and have battle with other monsters. Mix in the Pokemon League, where you have to go from gym to acquire badges in order to participate, and you have a goal that makes each episode exciting, since you don't know what the next challenge will be. Sure, there are episodes where it feels like the show didn't really lead to much of anything, but there were still a heck of a lot of moments that excited you, that shocked you, that got you just absolutely pumped up. And at the end of the 90s, not only had we already gone through the Indigo League and the Orange Islands, but we were well into our way through the Johto League. So yeah, there's plenty of content to warrant it being a place on this list. Not to mention that the anime also had movies that released in theaters. And you bet your ass I went to go see them. To my young mind, those were perfection. And they quickly became products that I would watch over and over again. Even my mother found it enjoyable, which when you're a kid excites you when your parent can connect with you with something that you love. So yes, bonus points for that.
As we reach the top 4, it seems like our lists are going to start to collide a little bit, combine if you will. Since Jan and I grew up in the same era, it's kind of a given we're going to have the same kind of top favorite animes. That brings me to my number 4, One Piece. This is actually a current watch as well. I watched a little bit of One Piece early high school, maybe middle school, and didn't really watch too much more of it as, again, this was a weekly show that came on TV. But now, as an adult, I am doing a daily watch-through of every episode that I didn't get to watch in high school and am 800 episodes in. It's an amazing show with a cohesive plot, fun characters. I'm excited to catch up, and as I've caught up, I've watched the movies, and I now have a Chopper tattoo on my body, which is why this show is in my top 4.
Here's a fun little fact for you. Yu Yu Hakusho was the first anime I ever owned. And it was fucking badass. I loved this show. I loved the action, I loved the characters, I loved the great blend of seriousness, but comedy at the same time, which, if done right, is one of my favorite aspects of any medium. And as this show is at number 3, yeah, it does it pretty damn well here. The story here follows Yusuke Urameshi, who dies in the very first episode. Heck, the very first minutes. A normalcy in many anime today, but not so back then. The only problem is, he wasn't supposed to die, and as a result, he has a chance of coming back to life if he performs a specific task. Without spoiling anything, one thing leads to another, and he ends up becoming a spirit detective, tasked with bringing demons to justice. Sound cool? Fuck yeah, it is. How do you make something like Spirit Detective not be cool? It can't be done. And I mean, who hasn't watched the show and pointed their finger and just shouted Spirit Gun at some point? It's a staple, alright? As the show progresses, you really start to care about all these characters. The tournament arc in the second season is fucking amazing. It has some big shocker moments. Has romance for all of you that need that romance in every anime you watch, you fucking weirdos. And of course, sexual harassment. Can't forget about the sexual harassment.
My number 3, Trigun. Finally, a show I can say I finished. This show was and still is a favorite and a repetitive watch through. I've lost count how many times I've watched this show. I still find something new every time I watch it, and it's constantly answering questions that I've always had about the show. The show follows Vash the Stampede, a mystery, a man, a crazy person. He likes donuts, but he's an enigma. No one knows who he is, what he looks like, or how to catch him. It follows these two women who are trying to find out who he is and get insurance money from him because he's a typhoon. He makes chaos wherever he goes, and it's not his fault. He gets captured, someone tries to fight him, and he's more powerful than he should be and explodes towns. Eventually, it culminates in a huge battle between him and his brother Knives, and they almost entirely wipe out a town again like they had done when they were younger. The show never ceases to amaze. I've constantly watched this show. I used to work at a summer camp where my nickname was Vash the Stampede. His love of donuts is amazing and unfounded, and I hope one day I can emulate that love as well. This is why it is on my top 3.
Here's a fun little fact for you. Rurouni Kenshin was the first manga I ever owned. And it was badass. This was a show that I fucking loved. Yes, the anime didn't end in the best way possible, but it doesn't matter because when the highs were high, god damn was it amazing. Some truly awesome fights. Back in high school and a little bit into college, when I used to write just for fun, I would take huge inspirations from Rurouni Kenshin. I would always want to make my characters just as cool as the show had. I wanted to make the fights as spectacular as the show did. I was pretty much infatuated with this product, which unfortunately I can't say I can be anymore. But we'll get to that a little bit later. First, the synopsis. We follow Kenshin Himura, a wandering swordsman who used to be known as the Hitokiri Batosai, a fearsome warrior who would kill any in his way during the Bakumatsu War. The series picks up a few years after the war where Kenshin wields a reverse blade, which is incapable of killing anyone. Why has he given up killing and taken on a more peaceful life is part of why you need to watch the show. Once again, we get a show that has a great balance between comedy and drama. Finding out about Kenshin's past and why exactly he's on this peaceful route is one of the highlights of the show. I love seeing all these characters come in and try to fight him like in the old days. And to be completely honest, this show has one of my favorites, if not my favorite anime character of all time, Saito. I freaking love this character. This sort of rivalry, maybe you would call it, against Kenshin. How he gets introduced, I freaking love that. I love the way that he has this life path that he just doesn't deviate from. It's that life path that he's chosen, and nobody's going to convince him of any other way to do things. And I love that. I love that stoicness about him. He's just badass, is pretty much all I'm wanting to say here. So yeah, I'm gushing about the show. So why the hell can't I be a fan of it anymore? Well, to talk about something a little bit more serious, quite frankly, Nobuhiro Watsuki, the creator of Rurouni Kenshin, is a complete and total scumbag. In November of 2017, the police ended up finding pictures of young naked girls in his office. As a result, they raided his house, where they discovered about 100 child pornography films. Nobuhiro, who was working on the Hokkaido arc of Rurouni Kenshin at the time, was fined the US equivalent of $1,500 and allowed to resume his work. Yeah, that's fucking bullshit. This man should have been fired, he should not be allowed to work anymore, and he should be in jail. And I am completely done with anything Rurouni Kenshin related, at the very least until he dies. So yeah, unfortunately, it is a show that I very much love. I still have very fond memories of. I get excited just thinking about a new show being created, like Toddy was saying earlier. But for me personally, I just can't watch that without thinking of what a terrible person Nobuhiro is. So yeah, it reaches this high on my list for nostalgia reasons, but that's as far as it goes. And that really is such a shame.
For my number 2 spot, my friend Jan and I here are gonna differ greatly. Because as it was his number 5, it is my number 2, and that's Cowboy Bebop. Of course, this has to be in my top 2. It's an easy watch, a great show, with an amazing soundtrack. This is a soundtrack I go to all the time, especially for easy listening and something to study to. The show is very episodic, and you can miss some episodes without having to catch up, and if you do get a little bit lost, the episodes are short enough that you can catch up, and you can actually watch the entire series in maybe a day or so. The plot works well with how the story is told, and honestly, I'm a fan of a short show, as you've heard me kind of complain through this whole list. Shows that are too long lose my attention personally, and because this show is so short, every episode gets to the point. I love it. It's an amazing show, and it is something I will always go back to because it always brings back nostalgia of turning Toonami on, staying up far too late past my bedtime, and trying to hide the fact that I was watching anime at 12 at night on a school night.
My number 1 goes to Trigun. That's right. Criminally underrated by Toddy here at number 3. I freaking love this show. Just listen to the opening. It's fucking amazing. This is one of those shows that does everything almost perfectly. Great freaking characters, great comedy, great drama, great blend of the two, mind you. Great action, just the way the story progresses. Hell, the main character doesn't even shoot his gun until like the 5th episode. And that sounds like it would be boring, right? But it's not. It's really not. And it has a purpose to it. Vash the Stampede is a wanted criminal with a $60 billion double dollar bounty on his head. Nicknamed the Humanoid Typhoon, he is said to bring destruction wherever he goes. But in anime fashion, it's not as simple as it seems. In reality, the man is a goofy individual with a penchant for hitting on ladies and guzzling down donuts. Most people who meet him don't even believe that it's the person on the poster. And yet, when the need calls for it, this man can be just as deadly as they say. Once again, we have a show that greatly influenced me. Not just in my writing in high school and college, like I said in my previous entry, but just about in everything. I still think back on that show and all of those amazing moments. Not just the funny moments, but the serious ones, the sad ones, the romantic ones. Like Toddy was saying, there's just a connection that you have with it. Why is this man acting the way he does? Why is he this badass that's on these wanted posters, but why is he also goofy? Like, these are the things that I was introduced with, this trope, with this show. Yes, it's something that was around beforehand, and heck is still around to today, but this was the first time that I witnessed something like that. And so it left a big impact with me. And those questions are answered. You just have to watch the show to find out what they are. The series hits all the right notes for me. And while I agreed that the final showdown did finish a bit too quickly, I still thought it was one heck of a finale. I pray that the new reimagining lives up to the original. Though, even if it did, I still think you would need to go back and watch what made that original one so special in the first place. It is easily my favorite anime of the 90s. And if there is one on this list you need to check out, it's this one.
I wanna be the very best, like no one ever was.
For my number one, I'm gonna have another disagreement with my friend here and say that his number 4 isn't good enough. It's my number 1, and it's Pokemon. I feel like as someone who grew up in the 90s, this is a cliche number 1 pick, but how could I not? The original Pokemon was pretty fun, and of course, because it came on every Saturday morning, it was part of my childhood lineup. I own a stack about my height of VHS with every different episode you could think of on it. Now, I don't own every episode, but I own almost all of them, along with almost every single original card. I also have tattoos on my body of Pokemon. So, I guess you could say, yeah, this is my number 1 pick. It is and always will be my favorite. It will be a show that, although I don't have children, I will show my children someday, and hopefully, like Jan's daughter, it'll be something I can share with them and they can carry on to their kids, or just even something I can play with them, watch with them, until they grow out of it and have their own anime fun. That concludes my top 10 anime list. How about you, Jan?
That's pretty much all I got as well. I hope you guys enjoyed each of our individual lists. Yes, they were very similar, but I think there was just enough variety there to really get a good sense of what we grew up with in the 90s. And yeah, if you guys haven't seen these shows, I think you should definitely check a majority of them out. Some of them might not hold up as well as when we were kids, but there's definitely some in there that should still be watched, are classics, and you will still enjoy.